record, and Mike, it's to you. You got to unmute yourself, Mike.
Okay, good morning and welcome. My name is Mike Alexander. I'm a retired police chief after 39 years of active service. I also served as a city manager in one of those cities. I'm a co-founder of Lion Strategy Group, and we're looking forward to this event this morning. To the panel, thank you for your willingness to be a part of this event. I personally reached out to each of you, and without hesitation, you all agreed to be a part of this discussion. Before we get started, I want to ask George Williams, our minister on the panel, to open us up with a prayer. And after your prayer, George Williams, my business partner, Chief Mike Wilson, will lay out the format and the discussion questions for this morning. We want each panel or each panelist to speak from your own level of comfort. George, if you will, open us up with a prayer, and Mike, you would take it away after that.
Let us all bow. Our Heavenly Father, Creator and the Maker of all, and the giver of every good and perfect gift, we come to you this morning. We give you thanks first for giving us life, for giving us health, for giving us strength, for giving us the right use of our minds. And we thank you for this panel discussion and for those who coordinated it. Lord, we ask that you would give us ears to hear, hearts to understand, and tongues to speak well concerning those things that need to be done. Help us, Father, to depend upon your wisdom and not upon our own understanding. Thank you for the skills and the intelligence that you've given unto these who have assembled. And Father, we pray for all of those who are looking in. We pray for our nation. We pray for this virus that you would give us a cure. We pray for the racial tension that exists, that we can find solutions and not just point fingers. Be with us, Lord. We need you. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen.
Thank you, George. Mike Wilson, if you will unmute yourself and proceed.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Pastor Williams, for blessing this event with prayer. I'm Mike Wilson, and I'm co-founder of the Lion Strategy Group, and I would like to welcome you all to Clearing the Pathway for Healing and Policing in America. We're living in interesting times in our country. Over the last 6 months, we've been impacted by a global pandemic and civil unrest as a result of the actions of a very small number of our guardians. We've seen fear and frustration evolve into protest and riots around the country, people believing their voice is not heard and feeling they must employ extreme measures in order to be heard. Our motivation for producing this event was to provide a platform for an authentic conversation, to focus on understanding and identifying root causes, knowing that if we're willing to address true causes, we're able to apply lasting solutions that meet the needs of our citizens, communities, and our first responders. We have assembled an amazing panel who all have a desire and the courage to speak up and speak out on the issues impacting our communities, states, and country. There are many people in our country who believe their voice has been silenced, and many believe actions taken by our leaders to address these issues are simply to appease the masses, project an agenda, or minimize the actions of people. For some, this belief comes from witnessing similar approaches that were applied in the past to address the issues of today, knowing in most cases that the same approach will lead to similar outcomes. If the response of our communities tell us anything, it is that policing strategies and philosophies are no longer congruent with community expectations. Sir Robert Peel, commonly known as the father of modern policing, spoke to this dynamic almost 200 years ago when he established the London Metropolitan Police Force on the following principles: to prevent crime and disorder as an alternative to their repression by military force and severity of legal punishment, to recognize always that the power of the police to fulfill their functions and duties is dependent on public approval of their existence, actions, and behavior, and on their ability to secure and maintain public respect. To recognize always that to secure and maintain the respect and approval of the public means also the securing of the willing cooperation of the public in the task of securing observance of laws. To recognize always that the extent to which the cooperation of the public can be secured diminishes proportionately the necessity of the use of physical force and compulsion for achieving police objectives. To seek and preserve public favor not by pandering to public opinion, but by constantly demonstrating absolute impartial service to law and complete independence of policy, and without regard to the justice or injustice of the substance of individual laws. By ready offering of individual service and friendship to all members of public without regard to their wealth or social standing. By ready exercise of courtesy and friendly good humor, and by ready offering of individual sacrifice in protecting and preserving life. To use physical force only when the exercise of persuasion, advice, and warning is found to be insufficient to obtain public cooperation, to an extent necessary to secure observance of law or to restore order, and to use only the minimum degree of physical force which is necessary on any particular occasion for achieving a police objective. To maintain all times a relationship with the public that gives reality to the historic tradition that the police are the public and that the public are the police. The police being only members of public who are paid to give full-time attention to the duties which are incumbent on every citizen in the interest of community welfare and existence. To recognize always the need for strict adherence to public executive functions and to refrain from even seeming to usurp the powers of the judiciary, of avenging individuals or the state, and of authoritatively judging guilt and punishing the guilty. To recognize always that the test of police efficiency is the absence of crime and disorder and not the visible evidence of police action in dealing with them. You know, whether it be an organization, a community, or country, there are three systems that are always at play: the operational system, administrative system, and the human system. We are very good at operating within the operational and administrative systems because there are visible outcomes and we can gauge performance and classify expectations. So when problems arise, those are the areas we go to in addressing them. This is our comfort zone, and we feel by proposing new laws, policies, and practices that the optics communicate to those whom we serve that we have heard them and we're taking action. I believe all of the efforts over the many years of reform attempts have brought about levels of awareness, effective laws, and best practice policies. However, we must recognize this is a humanity issue. Therefore, we must address the human system. But that scares us. It forces us outside our comfort zone, and we are unable to track progress as we traditionally have. The reality is this: legislation and policies alone will not yield systemic and sustainable change. So how do we do that? How do we achieve those goals? Well, to begin clearing the pathway, we must first identify what we want by asking a series of questions. But before we ask them, I would like to introduce our panelists to you, starting with Pastor George Williams with Church of Christ at Eastside in Austin, Texas, who holds a BS and MS in Biblical and Related Studies and is the author of Lord, I Need an Attitude Adjustment. Dr. Anthony Brown with University of Texas in Austin, who specializes in curriculum and instruction in African Diaspora Studies. Ms. Carrie O'Donnell, who is a coach, mediator, specializing in conflict resolution and organizational development. Dr. Rick Bradstreet, a police psychologist who served 25 years with the Austin Police Department. Ms. Evan Barbee, founder and teacher at Narrative Enneagram in Nashville, Tennessee. Lieutenant Antoine Lane with the Austin Police Department, a noted author, speaker, and voice narrator. Chief Mac Tristan, retired police chief from the Coppell, Texas Police Department and cultural strategist. Ms. Tanya Brown, a retired police officer and public information officer for Texas Department of Transportation. And Ms. Susan Hutson, a doctor of jurisprudence, independent police monitor for the city of New Orleans, Louisiana. Thank you all for joining us. I would like to just cover a few housekeeping items for any members in the audience who are not panel members. If you have a question that you would like to pose, there's a chat feature toward the bottom of your screen. If you will select that and select me individually and send your question along with your email address to me, we'll try to address it within the confines of this event. As for our panelists, you're all muted, so as you speak, if you'll just make sure that you unmute yourself. And with that, I would like to open the conversation with our first question. And that is, with the progress previous reform efforts yielded, why have those efforts failed to yield the systemic change our country now desires? And just a little add-on question to that, what is different today versus 20 years ago, 50 years ago, and 60 years ago? So with that, I'm going to back away and I will open the floor to any one of our esteemed panelists who would like to start this conversation.
All right, well, I'll jump in. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, first of all, thank you for inviting me here today. I'm enjoying having these conversations right now about what's going on, and with an eye towards a real chance to make some changes that can make a difference in folks' lives. And so I'm excited to be here, and thank you all also for being here. I've only been in police monitoring for the last 16 years or so, and I was in Austin for a while, so shout out to all my Austin folks there. I was at the Los Angeles Police Department before I came here to New Orleans, and now here in New Orleans overseeing the New Orleans Police Department. I'm also the president of the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, or NACOL, and if you're interested in learning any more about our organization or police oversight in general, please go to NACOLE.org. And again, NACOLE.org. But what's changed and what's similar? Well, I know that over the last, 10 to 12 years, there have been a lot more consent decrees and a lot more intervention by the Department of Justice, which has come in to work on professionalism, work on policies and procedures, to work on training and tactics. But in my opinion, what hasn't changed is the structure, right? The systemic issues that are wrong with the system have not changed. So for example, I'm reading, COVID has been a horrible time period, but it's also been a great time period to catch up on reading. So I'm catching up, I'm doing a lot of reading. I'm reading The New Jim Crow and White Fragility and The End of Policing I'm reading right now. And in that, which is not what it sounds like, it's more about what they're talking about, lessening policing's footprint and not asking officers to take care of everything that's wrong in society. But in looking at, listening to reading some of these books and hearing what these officers are saying, some things have, the structural systems have not changed. The structural systems that allow for more policing of more communities, whether it's children, mentally ill, whatever it is, it's just the homeless. Our system allows more and more policing of these things. And in this book, The End of Policing I'm reading, they were talking about particular neighborhood blocks actually in New York City. And I don't remember the borough, sorry, I'm not from the East Coast, but in this particular block, the government had spent $1 million to incarcerate individuals from that block. $1 million. I think what that $1 million would have done if it had been applied towards better schooling or mental health or services for children or something like that. So in my opinion, we have done a lot to make policing more professional, tactics better, training better, but we have not addressed the systemic issues that still need to be addressed. Thank you.
All right. Any one of our other panelists, would you like to share your thoughts?
Well, if I may, Mac Tristan here, I agree with Susan. I think that there has been so much discussion throughout the years. If you think back to the Rodney King incident, and even before that and after that, and mandates. What are the mandates, and what forces an organization to change? Even consent decrees. For example, the Oakland Police Department has been under consent decree for years, and they have continued, or at least in the past, I haven't kept up with them lately, but there was continual failure on these mandates that were imposed. What has changed? What forces an organization to change? Without getting into politics, even President Trump's recent emergency decree that he signed on law enforcement, there were recommendations. There was nothing there that said this must happen. Different organizations, different legislation, as Mike Wilson said earlier, legislation and policies are not going to change behaviors of police officers. I think we have come a long way. When I started policing 1,000 years ago, we didn't have body cameras. We didn't have car cams. All of that has changed. Legislation has changed, but those things alone are not going to change the culture. As Susan said, the architecture, the structure of the criminal justice system. How do we change that? How do we in Texas, how are we to change what happens in Minneapolis, in Atlanta, in Ferguson, Missouri? We have no control over that. And when these changes occur, it seems to be that the onus keeps falling to law enforcement, because we deal with everything that nobody else wants to deal with. I remember, and Mike, well, you were in Tarrant County, but in Dallas County, we had a meeting with the district attorney's office, with county judges, about 20 police chiefs for 2-3 years ago, talking about the need for support and trying to figure out this mental illness issue that we've been dealing with for years. Nobody wants to deal with mental illness. Not even family members of the mentally ill want to deal with mental illness. So they call the police, and we have no resources to deal with it. We're a Band-Aid. We take that individual, take them to the county hospital, and within 24 hours, they're released back. That doesn't solve the problem. We keep going back and back and back again to the same house. And then it escalates to a violent situation where the individual has lost total perspective of reality. And without their control, without medication, without treatment, it becomes a use of force issue for the protection of the officer and those around them. So there has to be an intentional change throughout this country that impacts policing across this country. I was looking at standards and requirements for becoming a police officer. They vary as much as they're night and day. In Texas alone, you can become a police officer with a GED or a high school diploma. And there's some agencies that require a bachelor's degree, and some are even extending to a master's degree. Why don't we across the board require that nationwide? There's no way. Ferguson, Missouri has a GED or high school diploma to become a police officer. I looked at Minneapolis. Now they do require, I think, an associate's at least, but then that's all they say. They talk nothing about ethics. They talk nothing about the the character, the integrity, the type of person they want to hire. And so until all these things are addressed, these things will continue to build. And as far as what's different today, I think people have quite frankly had enough. I remember in I guess it was 2016, July 7th, with the Dallas police officers were killed in downtown Dallas. That was another culmination that just the momentum of that movement seemed to stop when those police officers were all killed, and our focus changed dramatically. Now it's not going away. Still today there's protests across this country, and rightfully so. So I think there has to be some kind of national effort to have a standard of sorts to be in a police officer, and then have those other agencies step up where we need help, and not just a Band-Aid, but help where we're having to handle every type of call that comes through.
One of the good things about this time around is that there's some national attention to particular processes that police use. And police organizations, you guys know, are about having rules of how you behave. So there's an operation called the 8 that can't wait. And those are simply 8 procedures that are including things like don't shoot at vehicles, no chokeholds, you're expected to intervene when you see a fellow officer screwing up, a number of specific things that have shown to have real reduction rates in terms of fatalities. And like Austin, there's 8 of them. Austin, I think, supposedly thinks they have all 8, but they really have probably about 4 or 5. And so if those are simple to do, there's a lot of problems with the police culture itself, but the change the police culture is going to take a lot longer. And these specific 8 steps are a measurable kind of shift that is, I think, got promise.
Thank you, Mac, and thank you, Dr. Bradstreet. Any other thoughts on this first question from any of our panelists?
I definitely agree with Dr. Bradstreet. I think that we do have to change the culture within law enforcement. I also think that that falls back on the individual as well, and that overall it may be difficult, but as an individual, department or person employed by the department has those choices to make as well. And I think that back in the day, and I don't know that this has changed much, but I just feel that it has, is back in the day that we were held to higher standards, law enforcement. And now we've kind of gotten into that we're human and we make a mistake. And I definitely agree that we make those mistakes, but I definitely think that a lot of those mistakes that we're making is based on the culture within law enforcement.
Thank you, Tanya. Dr. Brown?
Yes, I mean, to address the question of change over time, I think my area is I'm in the field of education, so I do research on African-American males. I look at kind of the historical trajectory of how people respond to issues related to African-American males. And one of the things that you have not seen change are their perceptions that are attached to Black males. They may vary over time, but certain ideas remain stable. In fact, you could find ideas as far back as the 15th century related to ideas of men of African descent being more aggressive, being more physically stronger than other people. So still kind of mired in myth as to what that's what some believe created the conditions for Rodney King, that he was this kind of super physical human. He was in some cases subhuman. So I think in some aspects of the identity of the people are being served have changed over time, but certain things have remained stable, and it anchors in place bias. One of the things that I even teach at the University of Texas at Austin is that bias comes through repetition. And the ideas of repetition around kind of these racial hierarchies where one group is seen at the bottom and the perceptions are attached to them that are in that group go back as far as the 1500s. So they become almost completely part of our schema. We cannot think of a group outside of that. So the work that puts into bias will not occur in a 1, 2, 3 hour training. It has to be substantive. It has to be associated with the culture of a police force, of a school, of a hospital, or anyone that is serving the community. The work of bias is going to require an incredible amount of work, because the work that was put in to create it has a much longer shelf life than the work that it will. So I'm not saying you can't do it, because there's studies that show that we can, if it was constructed, it could be deconstructed. But the work that any kind of practitioner that is engaging, particularly law enforcement, because it's dealing with life or death and its timing, requires a deep level of professional development. And there's a policeman's equity group by a guy named Philip Goff. They're doing some fantastic work out of UCLA. Jennifer Eberhardt doing fantastic work. So there are people that do this. I think it's just the willingness of institutions to want to engage in these kinds of practices over the long run, rather than sufficing the pressures that are put on them to be able to put in place some type of professional. Like, look, we did it, we checked it off. We brought in Professor Brown to give a few talks to a few people, we move on. It has to be very much part of the culture over time in a longitudinal sense. We see success in communities between different entities, whether it's schools, hospitals, doctors, greater success when there's a greater effort that says the work of deconstructing bias is a long-term project.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. And just a follow-up question, either for you or for any of the panelists. You know, we know that the roots of policing go back a long ways, and that in some instances, especially in the South, have you know, has some very dark history, you know, as it related to the slave trade, late 1700s, early 1800s, and so on. How much of the community response that we're seeing now do you think is the result of maybe legacy trauma from past events? Because we're hearing all of these opposing views. You know, the term systemic racism versus we're not racist, you know, we just need more resources. So we have polar opposites in some conversations, but there's something driving this feeling. There's something driving the fear that we're seeing in our community. So if anyone would like to pick that up, or Dr. Brown, if you'd like to speak to that.
I think one, and I'll be brief because I already spoke, I don't want to take up the time, but I think one of the things that make communities react in the way they do to, in particularly what's happening now, there might have even been two opposing positions, and they've done some survey data on this, is that people will perceive that their actions are tied to their behavior. So it's a kind of a social contract. If I behave well in society and do everything that is right, then you'll do no harm. No harm will happen to me. My father was a New York City police officer. He raised us with a kind of a mindset for how people will react to you. What my hand should do when I'm pulled over, how I should react, to diffuse things. And in many instances, and I've been pulled over a lot of times, it seems like less as I get older, very much as I was younger, a number of times. But the process of diffusion was of information that was given to me. But I think the feeling now may be that we can do very little to diffuse. So even when we do yes sir, thank you, or we're not selling drugs on the corner, we're jogging, we're in a store, that the possibility of loss of life, the threat of loss of life is touching many people, to where that tacit agreement, that social contract that's embedded, that if I do right, it'll be reciprocated to me, has been lost. And I don't think we've seen quite this, where people are reacting emotionally. Personally, people reacting to it. I get hundreds of emails and phone calls and responses to this in a way that I've not seen before. So I would even say there's a personal response from my white colleagues at University of Texas at Austin and others, unlike I've ever seen. And this is not the first time we've seen this kind of racial divisiveness. even over the last 10 years. But there was something about this moment that I think sparked Breonna Taylor and others, that they were doing the right things. Breonna Taylor worked in law enforcement, yet the chance or loss of life, it's almost like you're in a racial contract. Like, you abide by the rules, but you could still lose. And I think that once that contract is broken, that's when you have people react in that way.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Brown. Ms. Hutson, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I just want to echo what Dr. Brown said. I totally agree with that. There was something about watching George Floyd's death that traumatized, I think, all of us, and really kind of opened up these stories right now of what's going on. And I'm going to give you some personal perspective here. My grandfather was murdered by a sheriff in Nacogdoches 70 years ago, and there was no accountability for it. Fast forward to 2020, would there have been accountability for George Floyd's death if not for that young lady who videotaped it with her phone? Maybe not, because our systems protect police violence. So, so that's really, it's finally just bubbling up. And I want to thank our young folks for uprising here and saying that we do have to do something about this. We have to reimagine policing. We have to do something about it. And I think one of the reasons it's such a viscerally tough thing to deal with is if you're in the criminal justice system and you identify that as a part of who you are. So for instance, I'm a former defense attorney, I'm a former prosecutor, I'm a former assistant city attorney dealing with police matters. And it took me a long time to see the systemic racism and systemic injustice. And once I figured it out, I had to start reading about it. Somebody had put in the chat box, the American experience of policing has a legacy, and you have to acknowledge that, and you really do. You have to see that this has gone on for a long time. You talked about, Mike, about the origins of policing. Even in the Northeast, it was about union busting and controlling subpopulations. So the history, Border Patrol, the history was about race, keeping people of a certain race out. So you have to look at these histories, deal with those, understand where they came from, and that those legacies are still codified in statutes or case law, a lot of that. So just wanted to echo some of what Dr. Brown said there. Thank you.
Awesome. And just follow up, Ms. Hudson, because not everyone understands the components of a consent decree process and what happens with that. Could you briefly just share what that process is and what causes that type of oversight?
Yeah, sure, Mike. So I worked under consent decree in Los Angeles and then here again in New Orleans. And in 1994, Congress passed the Omnibus Crime Bill, and included in that crime bill was a provision that allowed the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division to investigate police departments for constitutional violations, widespread patterns of constitutional violations, called a Patterns and Practices Investigation. And that gave the Department of Justice the power to come in, sue departments, investigate departments, and then hold them accountable through these civil processes, which are usually filed in federal court and controlled by a federal judge. And consent decrees are agreed to judgments where cities agree with the Department of Justice that there's a need for change. And then they lay out in paragraphs all the types of changes that need to be made, from training to internal affairs to recruitment, supervision, use of force, and then the investigations of those issues as well. And they're a pattern for reforming departments.
Thank you. All right. Are there any other comments on those two questions? If not, I'll move on to the next question for you all.
I'll jump in, Mike.
Yes.
Well, thank you for sharing, Susan. I really appreciate all that you shared in the personal testimony. I want to circle back around to something you said around kind of the younger generation getting involved. I think the conditions are right for change whenever the younger generation kind of begins mobilizing in the way that they are now. And I think it's partially due to the fact that introspection is really a luxury. In a world where most people are surviving and energy and attention go into trying to secure their existence, the younger generation has been gifted with this opportunity to really invest in their own mental health. They don't hold the stigma around therapy that their parents and their grandparents did. And I think what's really becoming crystal clear is the violence and the division that exists within a dualistic society when one group of people are posed against another. And so the only thing that's really possible in terms of building bridges in a dualistic society is compromise. And it reminded me of something that Anthony DeMello said, who is a Jesuit priest and teacher that I really love. He said, compromise, in a compromise, both parties lose. And maybe that's what we've tried to do in the past. In a non-dualistic society where we're really relaxing our defenses and opening up to the world around us and the individuals that live in our world, what is possible is reconciliation. And that is a restoration of right relationship, which if we, I'd love to hear what the other panelists say, but if we rewind the history of this country, we've never been in right relationship with each other.
Powerful statement, Evan, and you really strike to the heart of one of the major issues, in my opinion, that we're dealing with, and it's what we really talk a lot about in our training platforms when we go into police departments and other organizations. Is why is it so difficult for us to admit when we've been wrong? And so what we're really dealing with is our egos and attitudes. There's so much energy spent on trying to prove how we didn't make a mistake or how we weren't wrong or how we were justified, where if we would just take that moment to step back and humble ourselves, put the egos and attitudes to the side, be authentic in those relationships and admit when wrong's been done, we wouldn't see a lot of the things that we see right now. So thank you for sharing that. Any other comments?
Just very quickly, Mike, a couple of comments. What Dr. Brown, I believe, talked about very quickly a minute ago was about this training and required training of police officers. That alone is not going to change a culture. The Texas Commission on Law Enforcement every 2 years will come out with a new curriculum for police officers. A 4-hour training, mandated training on unconscious bias for police officers, followed by a 10-question test, is not going to change the behavior of a 5, 10, 15-year officer. It's not going to change the culture of an organization. That's not the answer. It's every day. Susan talked about the lack of criminal ramifications for police officers. I agree with that. I think that's changing. In Dallas County alone, 3 out of the 4 years, there have been 3 officers that have been convicted of murder, from Amber Geyer to an officer in Box Springs to an officer from Farmers Branch Police Department that are serving sentences today. That is changing. It's not enough. And to Evan's last statement, which I revert back to what Mike's comment earlier is policing a systemic racist culture. And that's been raised constantly in the last few weeks. Well, my argument is for police officers they're trying to do the right thing, the initial response, Mike, as you said, we don't want to admit when we're wrong, is no, I'm not a racist. I don't do that. I don't police that way. But if we take that premise at face value and say, okay, let's say that it's bigger than that. Because police officers are not manufactured in a warehouse. We're not programmed in an IT lab. They're raised in the field. Police officers come from the general population. We are your mother's, father's, brothers, sisters, neighbors, friends, right? So if we're going to say that policing is a systemic racist culture, then we have to literally look at the general population of our country. Are we a racist? Do we have these racist thoughts, behaviors, actions? Because we come from the general population. So I think it is minimizing it to say policing is. when we come from the general population, and we all have to look in the mirror, which I think what's happening today is forced every American to look in the mirror and say, what am I doing? How do I raise my kids? How do I raise my friends, my relatives? Who do I associate with? What do I read? What do I watch? What do I do every single day? And I'll get off my soapbox at that point.
Pastor
I'd
Williams?
like to comment. Yeah, I think Mark has hit upon a tremendous issue that needs to be addressed, because it's a personal, individual situation that each person has to deal with, because the human heart is the problem. No matter what you say, the human heart is the problem. And when I talk about the human heart, I'm not talking about that pumping your chest. I'm talking about the mind. For out of it are the issues of life. Proverbs 4:23. In Matthew 15, Jesus talks about this is where hatred comes from. And this is where envy and jealousy and murder, all of this stuff starts in the head. And so if we're going to be changing, it cannot be done merely with and through mechanics, because you can change the mechanics, but you cannot change the mind just through a workshop. It has to be that this is how you do it. This is what we want you to do. But at the end of the day, it's about what's inside of here. If I look upon another human being as being less than me, if I think that that human being is not equal to me, and his life is not, or her life is not as valuable as mine, then it's easy for me to abuse that person and feel good about it, because I don't have the perspective that that person is equal in humanity. And so when I start looking at how we change people, I go back to the premise of Scripture. Obviously, that God created us all in his image, and that every person in God's sight is equal. In Acts 17, Paul says, God made all nations from one man. So whether we like it or not, we are all related. And that's something that we have to realize. And how do we get people to understand that? I think there has to be, whether a person believes in God or not, whether that person is an agnostic or atheist, there has to be some training from a biblical perspective on the dignity and the sanctity of human life. And so if I understand that every person is human, and that every person's life is sacred as God said it is, then it changes my perspective when I approach a person. Am I going to take this life and make this life be less than my life? Or is this person's life equally as important as my life? And I'm going to approach that person with that understanding. So I look at things from a spiritual vantage point. And I understand that the externals are just those things that are the mechanics. But to truly affect change, you have to change the heart. And that goes back to what Mark said. You know, looking at self and examining self. What do you read? What do you think? What do you hear? How do you see people? It's a personal thing that change starts with me individually.
Thank you, Pastor Williams. And you're so correct, you know, and you, along with Mac and Dr. Brown, all hit on the common points, which are change starts with me, you know, with the individual. And when you look at, you know, we've talked about the culture piece, but not just the culture of the organizations. What is our community culture, and are they aligned? You know, going back to Sir Robert Peel, that notion that the police are the public and the public are the police indicates that there has to be congruence between the expectations of the community and those that are performing that role. So how do we get there? And that kind of segues into our next question, which is, you know, with what we're seeing now and what we're seeing today, do you feel confident that we're seeking to address the root cause, or do you think that we're just applying Band-Aids to the problem? And whichever you support, if you could just share your why for supporting that position.
So, a couple things. As a white man, there's a couple of resources that really open up my eyes to how things are. One is the Netflix documentary, The 13th, which refers to the 13th Amendment regarding abolishing slavery. And that documentary does a terrific job of describing how, yeah, on the law books, it was abolished, but the practice of keeping black men down and keeping black men in prison and using black men as cheap labor continues today. And that really is a great resource. The White Fragility book is a great resource. The other materials are also excellent. So I want to talk about the police, in the police view of themselves as the thin blue line that is the only defense against chaos in the society. And that is a view that creates, in response to what Evan was talking about, that's a view that creates an adversary relationship, which means the police against the rest of the world. And police, forget black people, police look down on everybody. I mean, police, not because they're egotistical jerks, but because they think their job is to maintain society. And so they think civilians are, you know, they're kind of idiots. And so then when you're a civilian or a citizen, worse, the citizenry, they don't understand how police really works. They don't understand how important this stuff is. And so then you've got this ability in that situation to not just demonize, but to justify restraining and killing somebody, like George was talking about. You become non-human. You become somebody who's breaking the law, someone who is just you know, in the way and should be controlled. And we have the force and we have the legitimacy to do that. For example, the Sandra Bland situation and the Elijah McNeil situation, those are both situations where police essentially provoked a confrontation with those people on the basis of wanting to score points in terms of making a stop, making some kind of a deal. And when those people resist, they are then killed in the process of overcoming their resistance. And so the process of police as the thin blue line is at the heart, I think, of police have to learn to back off. They have to learn to lose. Going out on, I went on a hostage negotiation situations forever at the police department. And once we were there, we were not leaving. Even though we blocked off blocks and blocks of the city to supposedly keep people safe. And it was perfectly okay just to leave an officer at the front door, an officer at the back door. There's not going to be killing anybody. And yet we were there because we were going to take charge. And so this notion that as police officers, these are good people. We're not talking about people who are, I mean, there are some people who are jerks and who want to abuse people, but most police officers are not that way. But the process of taking charge and having to dominate the situation, I think, is a major player in all these deaths.
Amen.
I totally agree with Dr. Bradstreet. And one thing I was going to say is that now with videotapes that we have, who's reviewing those in being in law enforcement for over 22 years, I don't think that those videos are reviewed often enough so that we can identify these problems. Also, use of force forms. A lot of times these officers that have killed other individuals, if you look at their track record, they have a lot of use of force. And why aren't we identifying that? And that's what I was talking about changing the culture in law enforcement, not accepting that behavior.
Tanya, you're absolutely right. Dr. Bradstreet, you're absolutely correct in that there are police officers that think all civilians are idiots and we're better than they are. You know, it's the old saying, we're the cops and you're not. Those people are easily identifiable. So what are we doing to either coach them to change that behavior and that mindset, because they're going to act on it, or get them out of the organization? Because if I guarantee you look at their pattern, they're going to have a history of these behaviors and these stops. The trooper involved in the Sandra Bland incident had a behavior record of doing these types of stops and acting this way with those people that he stopped. It was a power and control issue. Why don't we address them? And why don't we, just catch them at the early warning system that most best practices accredited agencies have an early warning system set up? But are we acting on it? Are we holding those officers accountable? And if not, and if we are, then why are they still in the organization? And that's an even bigger question for another topic of why don't we remove those officers out of the organization? Is it unions? Is it collective bargaining? Is it arbitration? I mean, a number of things that I know, and I have been personally involved in agencies where we got rid of an officer for misbehavior, serious misconduct, and after an arbitration hearing, they're back to work.
Mike, let me speak to that really quick. I appreciate what Mac just said. For over 30 years or so, I've traveled around the country going into agencies that were either going in or coming out of consent decrees. And in those agencies, the language, the behavior patterns were all the same. And one of the things that I've been able to do very meticulously is be able to pinpoint almost what an officer looked like coming into the profession, how they change, why they change, what are some of the things that are going on with them personally and professionally. And Mac is right. If we stop and slow down a little bit and pay very close attention to the behavior patterns of officers, Tanya also mentioned the same thing. All of these cops that are involved in these egregious issues all have a history of violence. Did they come in that way? No. I think most of them come in with the right reason and want to do the right things for the right reasons. However, the culture is so embedded with toxicity and so many different things that are going on and power play, as Dr. Bradstreet stated. So because of the work I did with Department of Justice and Federal Law Enforcement Training Center and a variety of other people, of officers coming into the profession, what they look like coming in, and then how they change, why they change, what are some of the things going on with them personally and professionally. And what we will find that 9 times out of 10, their personal problems will bleed over into the profession. And it affects how they work. And it affects 3 things: their motivation, their satisfaction, and their performance. And those things are tangible, quantifiable, and we can actually pay attention to those things if we, as leaders within the profession, stop and pay attention. The most important component within law enforcement is in that middle, those first line supervisors who are out there every day watching the behavior patterns of officers. This thing, a good mentor, a friend of mine, always say these 3 words: behavior, behavior, behavior. It is all about behavior. And George Williams is absolutely correct about the heart. And he's talking about the mind. It's the mindset. When we come into the profession and we are programmed in such a way to almost dehumanize people. I was one of those guys. And every cop, if they want to admit it, will say the same identical thing. We were programmed. I don't think it was an intentional thing, but it happened. And somehow that paradigm has to change. And we have to be able to create the space to allow people to speak into us. There's a guy by the name of Viktor Frankl who said between the stimulus and the response, there's a space. Leadership has a responsibility of creating that space to allow people to step in and be able to speak into them. But we have to create the culture to allow those things to occur. And we have yet to get there. I'm watching all of these police chiefs across the country talk about the issues, but they are staying on the surface and no one is digging deep. And someone mentioned, until we as an agency, our police departments, are willing to take our ownership in the problems that we have created in society, things will never change. We are a big part of the problem. But someone also said, we came from the general population. And because we came from that general population, we're systemic racism within the population. Look, I'm a cop for 39 years, and I have seen blatant racism right before my very eyes, using the N-word in a very comfortable way. That's a problem. And no one is addressing it. And one of the things about Lion Strategy Group, we have intentions of addressing the issues head on. And that's what this forum is about this morning. So thank you guys for your willingness to be a part of this discussion. And there will be many more. I'll shut up.
Thank you, Mike. Pastor Williams, did you have comments?
No, I think Mike hit it on the head. You can deal with things on the surface, but at the end of the day, you got to change the heart. You got to change that. And that only happens by putting people into situations where they are forced to deal with who they really are. It's called looking at the man in the mirror. Are you, at the end of the day, racist, or would you just say, I'm not? Everyone would probably say, I'm not. Very few people would say, oh, yeah, I am. But then when you start looking at your heart and being fair in your assessment of self and how you treat others who are not like you, then you can really start having a true assessment of the self. And I think that somehow or another, the police department needs to begin to deal with that, because Mike said a lot of things that I would say, and I had written them down, and someone else said that as well. I think it was Dr. Bradstreet, about the aspect of just being, I am the man in charge. And one of the things that I recognize is that people don't like their authority to be challenged. It's always like, who are you to challenge me? So if I ask you a question, why are you stopping me? You don't have a right to ask that. If I say, well, what did I do wrong? Stop resisting. It's always about trying to escalate as versus trying to say, this is another human being that has rights. And that person is just speaking to me. I had an incident, and I'll just be brief in this because I don't want to drag on, but it speaks to the issue where I had come to the airport and pulled up to the side to get luggage out of the car, and there was a policeman there. And there was an accident, very minor. I didn't pay attention to that because I'm trying to get my luggage out and get on time to catch flight. Then when I get ready to leave, pull away from the curb, I'm blocked in by the policeman. I simply ask him, sir, would you please move? I asked him very nicely, I need to catch a flight. He told me, no, I'm not moving. You shouldn't have pulled in there. That's your problem. And I'm saying, why are you treating me like this? I just asked you a very kind question, and I'm in a situation here. So I sat down in the car and waited, and he cared nothing about it. And I finally just had to say to him, sir, let me ask you a question. What did I do to you make you respond to me in this way? I'm a citizen. I asked you very nicely. I'm trying to catch a flight. I didn't recognize what was going on here. I asked you, could you please let me leave so I can catch my flight? And you attacked me. And so I'm saying, what's wrong with that picture? And everybody is looking at this. And I guess he finally saw himself. And the guy that was standing there taking the luggage said, man, I'm really glad that happened for you, because that officer doesn't take anything. Generally, he would have arrested you for saying that. That's scary. That I can't even ask a cop, a policeman, very kindly, sir, would you please move so I can catch my flight, without him coming back and saying something very nasty and dehumanizing. And I'm just saying there has to be training that says this is not okay. But then beyond that, accountability. Why do you treat people like that? And it should be some system of accountability that says, if you treat citizens like they aren't citizens, who are not even approaching you with an attitude or with aggression, what do you do when someone does have an attitude? I would hate to see that. So I think there has to be accountability as well.
Just very quickly, and I think Dr. Bradstreet hit on a topic that just impacts all of us. And going along with what Mike Alexander said, there's this book I read a few years ago called Managing the Unexpected. And I forget the authors, but the book tells stories of organizations, not just policing, all kinds of organizations of industry, where something went horribly wrong in that organization that changed everything. Bad stuff happened. And when they dug deep in there, they found that somebody in that organization, if not several people in the organization, knew that something bad was going on. And they did nothing, and they said nothing. I guarantee you all of these police officers that have come up in the media that have done some really stupid things, from the Sandra Bland trooper to the officer in Minneapolis, somebody in that organization, if not several line officers, knew that it was bound to happen. This person had a track record. They knew that this was going to happen at some point. So this concept of duty to intervene that police officers, that police agencies are starting to implement and say, yes, we have that policy, it goes beyond what they see at that moment. It starts hitting to what is your duty when you see this attitude, this behavior occurring in front of your eyes time after time after time. Why don't we stop it at some point? Why do we allow it to go on until somebody just totally violates somebody's civil rights by taking their life unjustly, or just severely beating them, or even harassing them, or taking their liberty away from arresting them for no reason? So that's even the bigger question that I think this duty to intervene concept needs to expand to.
My name's Roger Davis. I'm not a policeman, and I definitely respect this distinguished panel. But working in 35 years and in corporations, and they try their best to set up a culture, whether successful or not, but try their best to set up a culture where one can have some kind of evaluation process, in whether it be through an anonymous source or whatever, where you can review your actions for approval. Because I'm kind of thinking that, and maybe even watching TV shows or whatever, there's some of this unspoken code that, I don't want to tell on a fellow person because it might hurt my livelihood, it might hurt their livelihood. So it's kind of like the devil in all of us saying, don't say nothing. We don't want to upset, in their mind initially they may not think racism, and that could be that, but I'm this is my livelihood. And this is my friend, or this is my colleague, this is my comrade in battle. So do I even want to bring up the slightest, smallest thing where he or she will think less of me, or I'm not their friend, or I'm not backing them up? So, because I think we all agree we need that training up here. We need to talk about that in some safe Christian or whatever environment. But if that fear of, oh no, I was trying to help, but he or she gonna take it like I hate them, or I'm against them, or I want to get them fired, how we can create that environment where, because I believe we got a lot of great police officers, and a lot of them are on this call. But to help those to get to your level, and especially the new ones, creating that environment where they can speak up, and because all I want to do is be a better cop, versus keep it to myself, don't tell nobody, and God forbid everything continues the same way.
Great comments, Roger, and I appreciate you chiming in. They were very timely. But this kind of brings us to a point, and if you'll just mute yourself, Roger, so we don't have the background noise, is that we run into the dynamic where we're willfully blind for many of the reasons that Roger mentioned. But it goes a step further, and the case studies that we've completed over the years is that 99.9% of the acts could have been prevented had someone, spoken up and spoke out about it. And that plays into not just the espoused culture of the organization, but what are the subcultures that are growing with the small teams or the patrol shifts and those things. Dr. Brown, did you have a comment?
I did. I mean, I think one of the things that we have to avoid, and I did a study on racial violence in textbooks with Dr. Tanya Brown, and we found a compelling finding from our analysis is that the way violence is depicted, plantation, Jim Crow, and even civil rights, post-civil rights, is often as an individual actor. So an individual enactment of that racial violence, or a rogue group that's seen as an aberration. But one of the things that when we take, someone asked a question in the chat room, like, what is systemic racism? Systemic racism is when you're able to look at the matrix of actors that help reinforce the enactment of that violence as it happens. So we take Minneapolis, of course, you have a person who perceives George Floyd in a particular way and enacts that practice, but there are a whole system of ideas that go all the way beyond. It's a sociology of race that is around the police force. It's not just lieutenants and captains and even mayors. It's the whole system itself. But we often depict racism as the enactment of individuals. So I would say for many of the panel that have talked about this, we have to understand the multiple players and the sociology that creates the conditions. One thing that we haven't noted that is different is that we live in what is known as, we've gone through in the 80s and 90s, a deindustrialized economy. People were working and having a living wage. By the 80s and 90s, a variety of things converged and created communities of people that weren't just unemployed or underemployed, they had never been employed. We have populations of individuals that have never worked. And not because they don't want to work, but there is not an industry that helps service that. So what do you have? You have crowded communities that functioned and were created with for the workforce that it aligned with. So urbanicity comes in contact with the growth of industry. Industry changes, but you still have large numbers of people in places like Los Angeles and Detroit, but you don't have the police force to do it. And what happens is you have aggressive police forces addressing a population of conditions that they can't possibly maintain. So I think one of the things that when we analyze the sets of conditions, we cannot see police officers and the enactment of violence in a vacuum. You have to look at it longitudinally, and you have to look at the sociology of conditions that create it. And unemployment has and of course, we also know that by the late 80s, communities, integration had reached a pretty high peak in society, statistically, but it decreased dramatically after that, where students, housing created the conditions where communities were resegregated, as they called it. There's a whole work on this. Gary Orfield talks about the resegregation of schooling, where communities are now living in sets of conditions where schools are closed now, health services are closed, on high levels of unemployment, and then police officers have to function within the context of that, and not necessarily given the support for it, or the development of the kinds of dispositions we want police officers. Like my father, who was a beat cop, he says there's the law and there's the spirit of the law, and you work within that. And he walked in the South Bronx, working with people. So some of it's common sense, but I think there's also a set of conditions that make it difficult for everyone to function within that. And everyone has to be on board, from schools to communities to hospitals to banks to insurance agencies. We're all complicit in the system of racism. It's not just the enactment of racism by one individual. And our analysis of that has to engage those kinds of questions with police departments. So reform has to happen on multiple levels at the same time.
Right. And I think, Dr. Brown, you really speak to acknowledge what's going on, and let's reconcile with the past and current behaviors. But I think it also poses a question. If we're going to look at a deep dive on, we have to identify, what do we want? What do we want from a behavior perspective of our police officers in America? And I'll just kind of pose that as a question to all of you, because we're talking about behaviors that are not acceptable. So what behaviors do we want from our police officers? Anyone want to chime in on that?
I can. There's a theory called contact theory.
Okay.
And contact theory is a pretty simple theory. Gordon Allport, 1951, wrote in real simple sense that from a social psychological standpoint, people are going to have different, you're going to be able to understand people the closer proximity you have to them. So if there's this huge, so police departments have to be willing to go to schools, which they do, go into communities, coach teams, which I know they do. So we have to increase the good practices that have always been there. And that proximity is going to create a different set of eyes. If you don't mind me reading this quote from Ellison, he talks about this idea of invisibility, but I think it gets at what the problem of closeness and distance. When you see people from a distance and your perception of them so the schema that we hold about that group, and then we have physical distance from them, and then we have ideas that go within that when we come in contact. So if you could come in contact with George Williams, Brother George Williams, my minister, a good friend, we have a problem if we could come at him with an aggressive tone. So if it deters any way from that, we know what could possibly happen from that. So if the politeness, the thank you, the please could create aggression, then it's an issue of the eyes. So Ellison says, I'm invisible, no, not a spook like those who haunted Edgar Allan Poe, nor am I one of those Hollywood movie ectoplasms. I'm a man of substance, of flesh and bone, fiber and liquids, and I might even be said to possess a mind. I'm invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. Like the bodiless heads you see sometimes in circus sideshows, it is as though I've been surrounded by mirrors of hard, distorting glass. When they approach me, they see only my surroundings, themselves, or figments of their imagination. Indeed, everything and anything except me. I think Ellison gets at it in a very poignant way. So some of what we're trying to get at is fairly simplistic in a complex society.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Any other comments?
Miss O'Donnell had her hand up.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, so thank you very much. And I agree with all of the systems change that needs to take place. I was head of a philanthropic foundation for 13 years that fought for racial justice. And I myself was arrested for assault on a police officer when I tried to resist, and I was subsequently arrested. So these issues are very near and dear to me. My training and background is in both primarily the Enneagram and somatic experiencing. The Enneagram really pointing to people's motivations, their egoistic issues, what drives them. And then somatic experiencing is about how to work with the nervous system. And I think what Dr. Brown said about people do everything right, you know, we've heard that several times. And what we've seen is that even if you do everything right, these deaths occur, and it's not making sense at a logical thinking level, right? At this level, it's not making sense. So it's dysregulating people because it's not logical and it's not making sense. And then Mac talked about this duty to intervene, and how can we teach other officers to recognize when one of their own has clearly become dysregulated, their nervous system has hijacked them. And you know, basically police officers operate out of gut instinct. You know, we talk about the heart and we talk about the mind, but I think in reality on a daily basis, they're operating on gut instinct, and you know, they can get hijacked by their nervous system. And when they get triggered, they're reacting far out of proportion to what's actually happening. And so to have an understanding of the role of the nervous system, which is really designed to protect us, but when it gets triggered by ego issues and other issues, even fellow officers can recognize, you know, that reaction is out of proportion to what's happening. And so to help officers understand the role of their nervous system and the nervous system of their fellow officers, to be able to recognize when their nervous system is getting hijacked, right? And so, and I think Mike also said it's really hard for people to admit when they're wrong, and because we want to rely on our gut instincts, we want to believe they're right. And so, and if police officers are primarily relying on that, and it's dysregulated and it's causing overreactions, you know, it's really where we need a better understanding of how it operates, how it tries to protect us, how we can recognize in our fellow officers when they've been hijacked. So that's my training and my background, the Enneagram to address the egoistic, the motivations of different police officers, and then somatic experiencing, which is how to recognize the role of the nervous system and how to work with it.
So Carrie, just as a follow-up, you know, we've seen through studies or through surveys or those things, and operating from the perspective of the Enneagram and levels of mastery or levels of health, would it be a safe comment to say that a lot of our police officers are not as healthy emotionally and mentally as maybe they were when they entered the profession?
Yes, and the reason is because if they're never taught the skills, how to regulate their nervous system, the stress kind of accumulates, right? And, you know, Mike also spoke to that as well. They come in with the right motivation, with the right attitude, and then over time, because we are each dysregulating our nervous systems, right? Our nervous systems are always communicating, and so that's what's happening. And I think if we could educate officers about the role of that. And, you know, our nervous system is our angel, right? It's our angel because it's designed to protect us. It's our number one protector, but it gets a little misguided, right? It's our misguided angel. And a lot of that has to do with our Enneagram type and what triggers us, you know, from according to our ego structure. And yes, so very much so, if we don't manage that traumatic stress, it starts to accumulate, and then it really causes problems.
Right. So that, you know, and that has been a prevailing recent topic as it relates to police officers and their role in the mental health process in their communities. But one area that that we believe we've not really acknowledged and tapped into is that there's a high possibility that some of our most mentally ill segments of society are the men and women who are serving those communities as guardians because of the unaddressed trauma, the dysfunctional coping skills, strategy, the stress created within just the organization in and of itself. So would you agree with that statement?
I can't speak to that because I don't know the prevalence of, you're talking about mental illness within the police force. I can't really speak to that. I don't know, but I do know that when traumatic stress, even on the job, starts to accumulate, it really interferes with the proper functioning of the nervous system, and people's nervous system become dysregulated. And then you see they get hijacked by their nervous system, and their response is out of proportion to what's actually happening. And I think that quote that Dr. Brown read, the Ellison quote, is a true testimony of an attempt to try to bring someone into the present moment, bring their conscious awareness to see reality as it actually is, not how they're perceiving it, but how it is, right? Bringing somebody right into the present moment, because all of these biased perceptions, they are wired into the nervous system, and it's scanning. The nervous system is constantly scanning for threat, and it itself is biased. So if there's this much information, it's going to pick up on that one little piece that fits into a pre-existing bias. So our biases are wired in, again, in the nervous system, and that's where we can do a lot of work to address that.
Awesome. Thank you, Carrie. Great comments. Anyone else, would you like to comment on this piece?
A couple of comments about what Carrie just said. The number of police officers that kill themselves is twice the number of the police officers get killed by bad guys. So there's huge depression and stress in the police work. And one of the things that keeps officers jacked up unhealthily is the supposed safety training that says you should always think about the worst case scenario. In other words, if you're And it works in some ways. I mean, for example, when officers get a call to like a family disturbance call, and so they arrive at the home, it's sensible not to stand in front of the front door because there's a chance you're going to get killed. In fact, one of our police officers in Austin got killed that way. But and so that worst case scenario means you stand to the side of the door. But in terms of walking around and having that as a safety device, the worst case scenario, that just creates chaos and creates overstimulation and ends up with officers killing people unnecessarily. Like we had a case in Austin where a young officer shot and killed a naked black teenager who was approaching the officer just because he was frightened and the officer was frightened, and never should have happened, but he was got scared and went stupid. And that kind of thing, the worst case scenario thinking, is a huge dilemma. Anyway, so that it's a big part of the not just the culture, but the psychology of being warriors that makes a problem.
So, Lieutenant Lane, you tried to jump in earlier. Thank you, Dr. Bradstreet.
No, I appreciate Dr. Bradstreet's position on that. Just from a trainer standpoint, and it's been touched on already, that there's, by the time the cadet graduates from the academy, there's an adversarial relationship that he has with the public. And that's done in its best case scenario to try to keep that person alive. I mean, it's what the training academy is typically built upon. They try to professionally develop in other areas, but by the time the person leaves, they're built on trying to stay alive. As a result, the survival mechanism that they use every day just to get through a shift safely, you guys all know, what happens oftentimes in metropolitan police departments are that officers are hitting the street to terminate the call. They've got a great call load waiting for them. Before they get on shift, that same level of call load would be left when they leave the shift. So 10 hours in, they haven't made much headway. So what happens is police officers are rewarded either by respect to their peers or by their first line supervisors, like Mike said, the most powerful person in the police department, in trying to get through the call load. So they'll get to a call, try to terminate that call to get to the next call. As ethically as they can, as methodically as they can, they simply try to get through the call load. Well, that's a mark of an underdeveloped performer. What we need at this point, when you talk about police reform, what exactly does police reform look like? Well, you take the most influential person in the police department, which is the first line supervisor. He's yielding the most powerful person at the police department, which is the police officer. No police chief could stop what Derek Chauvin did. So the police officer in their day-to-day operations, the most powerful person in the department. The chief is the most authoritative person in the police department, but the most influential person in the police department is the first line supervisor. They wield the power. So you take the first line supervisor and you have him establish a culture of providing service, which is different than terminating the call. Because of mass hire and retire, we're short on the street. We've had dwindling applicant pools for the last 10 years. But if I'm going to a call, like the famed example of a domestic disturbance, and in Texas, I make an arrest of a Spanish-speaking only male for a domestic violence with a Spanish-speaking only female, and I take this breadwinning suspect to jail, and I leave that spouse with a pink pamphlet that's been translated into Spanish for them to follow up on how to get this person out of jail. But there's nothing talked about on how we're going to get the kids to school the next day. There's nothing we're talking about what's going to happen to this person over the next 72 hours. That is providing service. But my regulations and operations say, make the arrest academically, provide the pamphlet academically, write the report, move on to the next call, because I want to make my supervisors and peers happy. So we're stuck right now in a place where the termination of the call to get to the next call is rewarded, when in fact, learning how to provide police service will engender the relationship day to day. It's the day-to-day lack of relations through contact theory, like Dr. Brown talked about, that ultimately leads to these large-scale events that we see on television. You can look back not only at the conduct of the individuals that are involved, but you can look at what they did or didn't do throughout the weeks leading up to that. in practicing police work. And that's something that we've lost an art of.
Thank you, Lieutenant Lane. Tremendous comments. Ms. Hutson, I see that your hand is up.
One of the things I'd love to see in policing is just along the same lines of the discussion I had a little earlier, is I would just like to see more of officers knowing the history of policing, and not sugarcoating it either, learning where it came from, the systems of control, why it's there. I think those are all very important, as Evan mentioned about reconciliation. You gotta acknowledge that past in order to move on from it. So that's just something I'd like to see in training for police officers.
Awesome, thank you. So, this kind of brings us to where the rubber meets the road. Is obviously we're not going to solve this problem in this little panel discussion today, but we can start the conversation, and we'll continue to have this conversation in this type of format, bringing in our experts and those folks directly impacted by it. But what does a pathway look like that we need to take to ensure that our law enforcement behaviors meet the needs of the people over time? What are some first steps? Because we're hearing about, it's great that we have these duty to intervene policies, and it's great, that they're looking at new legislation and all of those things. Those are great things. But we just spent the last 20 minutes talking about why those policies and laws aren't working. And it comes down to the individual and the individual behavior. So what must we do? What are some first steps to truly start addressing what the root cause of this is, which is it sets in that human system, because we're dealing with people. So any thoughts on that?
Mike, one of the things that I think it starts with the leader of the organization. As you said earlier, we're hesitant to look within. We're hesitant to be critical of ourselves. We're hesitant to admit mistakes, to admit we can do better. We've become this machine of all powerful, can handle anything. Everybody's mentioned it, Lieutenant Lane. We actually addressed the problem of going call to call at one of my agencies when we started applying problem-solving techniques, which we don't have time to get into. The behavior part that you brought up earlier is critical. How do we want our police officers to behave? I believe we have to focus on the emotional intelligence of our police officers, the EQ factor, and how do they relate to other people? How do they solve problems? What behaviors are they doing? It's interesting, there was a study done several years ago in a large agency in the Northeast where they were having terrible police-community relations, and they brought in a consultant company and they interviewed several segments of the community, and they had terrible reviews as to how they deal with people, how they interact with the community. But as to how they solve problems, they got really high marks. And it gets back to what Pastor George was talking about is we need to look at ourselves in the mirror, because what was happening is in this neighborhood, there was one problem. There was a problem with these drug dealers and gangbangers and just doing all kinds of terrible stuff. And people were angry. So they called the police. Well, the police came and took care of the problem, but they didn't do it in a very ethical or legal way. They beat these guys up. They just tore them out of the house, probably an illegal search, and put them away in jail. Now, how long did that last? I don't know. The community actually applauded because they got rid of the problem. The neighbor was like, I don't care what they do, get them out of my neighborhood, which is not the way to address problem. But what it taught that organization is that's the way to address problems. So getting back to what you said earlier, Mike, is we hire these really, these people that are just on fire to help and change the world and to serve, and then something happens in their careers. At my organization, and what I've been able to talk about throughout this country and abroad sometimes, is this concept of servant leadership as police officers, where we see each other, we see ourselves as servant to our community, servants to each other. help serve others and resolve their problems, whatever that may be. So we started focusing on the self, because what was happening is these young officers were just, who knows what they were doing on their off time, and just flooding their brains with this, how police officers should be wherever they were getting this information from. And the trend started happening where police officers started seeing themselves more as a military organization than a police service organization. They're even starting to dress themselves like Navy SEALs. You know, I'm like, we are not deploying to war. We're not at war with our neighborhoods. And if you have that mentality, every time you hit the streets, guess what's going to happen? You're going to find a battle and you're going to overreact. We can't do that. So we started focusing this concept of looking at the individual, becoming the best version of ourselves. We started looking at the person as the physical part, the relationship part, the intellectual part, and the spiritual aspect of the individual. And how do you bring all that together to serve your community, to serve your family, to serve your friends, and not get into this warrior mentality that we're at war with everyone. And I'm gonna dress up with every piece of armor that I can and just canisters all over me, and I'm gonna go answer a call. That is absolutely ridiculous. So the behavior part is huge. Where do we go from here? It starts to looking at ourselves really with a critical eye, and how do we transform ourselves to be more of a truly service oriented organization by becoming servant leaders for our community and for ourselves.
And that's an excellent point, Mac. Not only have we seen just the physical appearance change of those officers on the street, look at the recruiting ads and what they're promoting to interest people in a career in law enforcement. They're only speaking to the adventure. You know, they show the SWAT teams, they show K-9, they show all of the hard skill training, and that's what they speak to. And then they have a process to where they're just focused on finding an individual that meets the technical skill requirements for the position. And we don't look at the EQ side of it. And we're not hiring people for the aspect of the nobility of the position, the honor that it is to be one who serves others, who places others above self. So great points, great points. Any of the other panelists have comments?
I'll just say this real quick. Mr. Tristan, okay, I hope I got the name right. He hit upon what I just had to sit here and just shout in myself. Servanthood, servant leadership. That's the leadership that the Bible talks about, servant leadership. Jesus demonstrated that when he washed the disciples' feet. And he said, if I'm your Lord, if I can do this to you, then you should be able to do it to others. Greatness is found in serving and not lording over people, not being taskmasters, but serving people. When people know that you care, then people will have a different attitude toward you. If you believe that a person does not care and that person is out to harm me, that I'm always defensive and I'm always looking for a way to avoid you, but it's never positive. So servanthood is critical. And I thank you for bringing that up, because I wrote a note to that point. And a lot of times people think that if I have an attitude of meekness about myself, that means I'm weak. And I think all of us understand that meekness and weakness are not the same thing. In fact, meekness is a very powerful concept that's set forth in Scripture. Meekness has to do with power under control. It has to do with breaking of a wild horse. That horse is wild and has all of that power, but it's not useful because it's going in every direction. When you break that horse and train the horse, it has not lost the power. It has just brought it under control, that now it's useful. And that's the concept of meekness that's taught in Scripture. Not that you are weak, but that you've learned how to control your power and direct it in a fashion that it is useful and beneficial instead of damaging. And I think that that concept needs to be taught, that it's not weak of me to approach a person with an attitude of humility.
Well, amen to what you just said. And when I teach and when I travel and then do these talks on that, many people have this concept of servant leadership as being subservient leadership, which is not what we're talking about. And the reality is, when you come across as a person that serves others, puts others first, you gain more power because people are willing to listen even more. And it's not about weakness. And serving even goes into, we even talk about, if I stop that DWI, that guy for driving while intoxicated, and I have to arrest him, that's still serving him, his family, and everybody else in the community. Now, we can go overboard to Carrie's story. I remember being a deep nice lieutenant, and we arrested some little bitty girl for DWI. And next, I'm looking at the charges, and they charge her with assault on a peace officer. And I'm like, what is that? Well, she kicked me, sir, when we were in the intoxilizer room. I'm like, you got to be freaking kidding me. She's drunk. Drunks fight, okay? We're not going to hammer them for every little thing that we can, just because we can, because we're the cops and you're not. So even a ticket, even an arrest is a form of servant leadership. But beyond that, it's taking the time to understand who you're talking to, understand and connect and empathize with these people. And how do we help you? What can I do to help you? Because every day we come to work, I would tell my officers, you have the opportunity to impact people's lives. How are you going to impact them today? Are you going to impact them in a negative way or in a positive way? The choice is yours as to how we do that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mac. Any other comments from our panelists?
Mike, I think time is far spent. We promised an hour and a half, and we have surpassed that. We can go on, as you know, and talk a whole lot more about this issue, but we're going to go ahead and I think close at this time. But I want to just say to the panelists, I deeply, deeply appreciate each of you for your willingness to be a part of this discussion. There are many more of these to come. And thank you again for your willingness to be a part. You know, John F. Kennedy, many years ago in the 60s, and we were dealing with a lot of issues back then that really has shaped our country today. And one of the things he said, he was actually speaking at a commencement at American University. It was actually June 10th, 1963. And one of the things he said, first of all, let us examine our attitudes towards peace itself. He said, too many of us think it is impossible, and too many of us think it is unreal. But that is a dangerous, defeatist belief, and it leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable, and that we are doomed by forces we cannot control. I want you to think about that for a moment, because what he's really saying is that if we don't think that we can make a difference, then there's absolutely no reason to be even trying to make a difference. And it's a mindset. Yogi Berra said that 90% of the game is mental. And we have to go into every situation recognizing that we're looking for a win-win. And a servant will go into situations looking for a win-win. Charles Swindoll, who said that our attitude, as long as I recognize my attitude is my altitude. And we have to recognize that attitude determines how far we go. The beauty of Kennedy's speech, however, he didn't stop there. He said we need not accept that view because our problems are man-made and therefore they can be solved by man. And man can be as big as he wants. No problem with a human destiny is beyond human beings. And man's reasons and spirit have often solved problems that seemed on the surface to be unsolvable. We've done it once, twice, and I believe we can do it again. We absolutely can solve this problem that was created by man. Man created this problem. And we as human beings can solve this problem. We just need to get on the same page. Easier said than done. I recognize that. But this is where it starts in situations like this today. Again, thank you guys so much for being a part of this discussion. We look forward to connecting with you more in the future. and look out for Lion Strategy Group, because we are going to we're going to do some great things for this country and for policing. So, Mike, I'll turn it over to you as we close out today.
Just to close, great progress made with the conversation. I really appreciate the authenticity of the comments, and just the vulnerability that everyone displayed in sharing experiences. You know, I would just like to put out there our contact information for you guys. If you're interested in learning more about us, you can find us online at lionstrategy.group, or you can email me directly at mike.wilson@lionstrategy.group. And I'll send that out in the chat as well if you want to copy and paste that. We've been very blessed in that we're working with multiple police departments and some cities who have recognized challenges within the organization as it relates to culture, subculture, the behavioral piece involving their people. And we would like to partner with you and serve you and yours if we can be of any service at all. But if I was going to leave you with just some last thoughts in what we gleaned from this initial conversation, and this will be the first in a series of online events that we'll be bringing to you, is that number one, we have to recognize where we come from. And we have to reconcile actions of the past in order to move forward. Number two, we have to rethink how we're selecting our police officers. We have to transition away from hiring for technical skills and focus on the emotional intelligence involving with those folks that we're bringing in. And that can be done. We actually have software and processes to aid in identifying talents, behaviors, and motivations, where we work with the internal stakeholders, but we also work with the community to answer that question: what behaviors do you want in your officers? What virtues are necessary to achieve those desired behaviors? Lastly, we have to recognize that the most powerful person in a police department is that frontline supervisor. Those sergeants, those corporals, if that's the respective rank structure, they're the ones that are closest to these officers. And we cannot be willfully blind. We have to support them. And we have to train them to recognize the red flags when they're right there in front of them. Those programs exist through the Lion Strategy. And again, we would like to assist you if we can. So with that, we would just like to say thank you. We will be posting this recorded session on our LinkedIn site. So please search us out, Lion Strategy Group, LLC, or Mike Wilson or Mike Alexander on LinkedIn. Connect with us, and then you can be up to date on all of our events. So with that, just if you'll give it about 2 minutes before you log off, and I'll be pushing out my email to everyone. Please contact us if we can serve you. Thank you.